The fine arrived 3 days before Christmas, tucked neatly into an HOA envelope that looked no different from the dozens that had come before it. The timing alone felt deliberate. When the envelope was opened, the number printed inside stood out immediately, heavy and unmistakable. $1,450. Not a warning, not a request. A fine? Already issued, already logged, already past the point of discussion. The reason listed beneath it was even more surreal. Christmas decorations deemed illegal under community guidelines. Outside the house looked like dozens of others across America in December. Soft white lights traced the roofline. A wreath hung on the front door. A modest inflatable snowman stood near the porch, gently swaying in the cold breeze. There were no flashing strobes, no oversized displays, no loud music. Just a family trying to hold on to something warm and familiar in a year that had already taken more than it gave. The neighborhood itself had always sold the minute image of harmony. Clean streets, uniform lawns, and an HOA that claimed to exist solely to preserve property values and community standards. In reality, it operated more like a quiet surveillance system, run by a small group of people who seemed to thrive on enforcement rather than cooperation. The family had lived there for years without incident. Payments made on time. Rules followed carefully. Complaints non-existent. They were the kind of residents HOAs loved on paper and ignored in practice. Until the decorations went up, it started subtly. A notice taped to the door warning of potential known complaints. No fine yet, just a reminder that exterior decor must be approved. The notice arrived after the decorations had already been up for less than 48 hours. Confused but cooperative, the family submitted photos through the HOA portal, expecting a simple acknowledgement. Instead, silence followed. Then came the second notice. This one referenced vague clauses about seasonal displays, electrical usage, and uniform aesthetics. Still no fine, but the language had sharpened. It carried an undertone that felt less like guidance and more like threat. By the time the fine arrived, the message was clear. This wasn't about the decorations. It was about control. The HOA president had a reputation. She was known throughout the neighborhood for aggressive enforcement, selective interpretation of rules, and a habit of escalating minor issues into costly problems. Some neighbors quietly removed decorations after receiving similar warnings. Others paid fines without protest, fearing retaliation if they pushed back. But this fine was different. The amount alone made it impossible to ignore. It was more than some families spent on gifts for the entire season, more than a monthly mortgage payment for many, and it came without a hearing, without a vote, without any attempt at resolution. The family gathered around the kitchen table, the fine notice lying flat between them like an accusation. The timing cut deeper than the number. Christmas was days away. Budgets were already stretched. Emotions were already high. This wasn't just a financial hit. It felt personal. A closer look at the HOA bylaws revealed something unsettling. The sections cited in the fine were outdated, written years earlier, and contradicted by more recent amendments that allowed seasonal decorations within reasonable limits. Limits that the family's display clearly fell under. Even more troubling was the lack of consistency. Several houses on the same street had far more elaborate displays. Bright colors, oversized inflatables, even synchronized lights. None of them had received fines. None had been warned. The enforcement wasn't uniform. It was selective. That realization shifted the tone from confusion to anger. Documentation began immediately. Photos of the decorations, screenshots of the bylaws, records of the submitted approval request, emails showing no response from the HOA. Everything was organized, time-stamped, and backed up. This wasn't going to be handled emotionally. It was going to be handled correctly. The family requested a formal review, as outlined in the HOA's own procedures. The response came quickly this time. The fine stood. Payment was expected within 10 days. Failure to comply would result in additional penalties. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the contradictions. No recognition of the holidays. Outside, the decorations still glowed softly each night. A quiet act of defiance. Neighbors began to notice. Questions were asked in hushed tones. Some shared similar experiences. Smaller fines. Warnings that came out of nowhere. Threats that disappeared only when compliance was immediate. A pattern emerged. The HOA president had been targeting certain households more aggressively than others. Families with children. Homes that didn't perfectly match her idea of uniformity. Anyone who didn't immediately fold under pressure. The fine wasn't about lights. It was about reminding people who held power. As Christmas Eve approached, the stress became impossible to ignore. The decorations that once brought joy now carried anxiety. Each light felt like a liability. Each ornament a potential trigger for another notice. But something else happened too. The family stopped feeling alone. A neighbor quietly shared contact information for a local attorney familiar with HOA disputes. Another forwarded an email thread showing similar fines issued and later quietly withdrawn after legal pressure. Someone else mentioned that the HOA president had already been warned by the board about overstepping authority. The image of an untouchable enforcer began to crack. The family made a decision. The fine would not be paid. Not yet. Not without a fight. A formal dispute was filed. Legal counsel was consulted. The documentation grew thicker, stronger, more undeniable. Christmas morning arrived with mixed emotions. Gifts were opened. Smiles were shared. But the fine loomed in the background, a reminder that the conflict was far from over. That afternoon, another envelope appeared. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was a notice scheduling a mandatory hearing, moved up unexpectedly, set for just days later. The timing was no coincidence. The pressure was increasing. What the HOA president didn't realize was that the fine had already done something she hadn't intended. It had unified people who were tired of being quiet. It had pushed a family from compliance into resistance, and it had set the stage for a confrontation that would expose far more than a dispute over Christmas decorations. The lights continued to shine that night, steady and unapologetic, as the neighborhood braced for what would come next. The days leading up to the hearing moved slowly, weighed down by tension that refused to lift. Christmas passed, but the fine lingered like an unwanted guest, hanging over every quiet moment. The decorations remained up, not out of defiance anymore, but out of principle. Taking them down now would feel like an admission of guilt, an acceptance of a narrative that never should have existed. The hearing notice was examined carefully. The date had been accelerated. The location was offsite, not the usual community room. Even the wording felt rushed, almost aggressive. It became clear that this wasn't meant to be a fair review. It was meant to intimidate, to overwhelm, to force a quick surrender before outside attention could grow. Preparation became the family's focus. Every bylaw section was printed. Amendments were highlighted. Photos of neighboring homes were organized chronologically, showing displays far larger and brighter than theirs, untouched by enforcement. A timeline was created showing how the HOA had ignored approval requests, then jumped straight to punishment. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the fine wasn't just excessive. It was unsupported. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Word spread faster than expected. Neighbors began comparing notes, sharing screenshots of fines, warnings, and threats that mirrored each other almost perfectly. Different houses, same language, same signatures, same escalation pattern. What once felt like an isolated incident was now unmistakably systemic. The HOA president, meanwhile, doubled down. Another notice was sent, reminding the family of potential additional penalties if payment wasn't received promptly. The tone was sharper than before, less formal, more personal. It read less like an official document and more like a warning. That warning backfired. By the time the hearing arrived, the room felt different. Chairs filled more quickly than usual. Faces that had never attended HOA meetings before were suddenly present and came out of curiosity. Others came out of solidarity. A few came quietly angry, carrying stories of their own. The HOA board members took their seats with visible discomfort. This wasn't the controlled environment they were used to. The energy had shifted. The usual silence was gone. The HOA president entered last, carrying herself with practiced confidence. But something was missing. The room didn't defer to her the way it once had. Eyes followed her, not with fear, but with scrutiny. The proceedings began, and the fine was presented as a matter of policy enforcement. Seasonal decor violations, electrical concerns, community uniformity. The same recycled justifications, delivered with rehearsed certainty. Then the documentation was introduced. The amended bylaws allowing seasonal decorations, the approval request, timestamps, the lack of response, the photos of similar and larger displays across the neighborhood, the uneven enforcement, the inflated fine amount compared to past cases. Each piece stripped away another layer of credibility. The board members shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others leaned forward, reading more carefully than they ever had before. This wasn't a routine complaint anymore. It was a demonstration. As the evidence stacked up, the narrative changed. The fine no longer looked like enforcement. It looked like overreach. Then came the most damaging revelation. A previous board email surfaced. One that quietly warned the HOA president months earlier about excessive fines and selective enforcement. It was brief, but unmistakable. She had been cautioned, and she had continued anyway. That email changed everything. The room felt heavier after that. The authority she leaned on began to fracture in real time. This wasn't just about Christmas decorations. It was about pattern, power, and accountability. The board recessed briefly. When they returned, the tone was markedly different. The fine was declared under review. Enforcement procedures were questioned. The legitimacy of the citation itself was openly challenged. Within minutes, the decision was made. The fine was voided in full. Not reduced, not deferred, eliminated. But it didn't stop there. The board announced an internal review of recent fines and enforcement actions. An independent audit was proposed. A temporary suspension of discretionary penalties was enacted until new oversight guidelines could be established. The HOA president sat silent, her authority dissolving in layers. The room no longer felt like it belonged to her. It belonged to the people who lived there. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Fines issued under similar circumstances were quietly refunded. Warning notices were withdrawn. The website updated its guidelines, clarifying seasonal decor rules in plain language for the first time. And then came the resignation. It was announced without explanation, framed as a personal decision, but no one believed that. The timing was too precise. The pressure to public. The pattern, too obvious. A new interim president was appointed, one who immediately emphasized transparency, communication, and consistency. Open forums were scheduled. Residents were encouraged to ask questions. Enforcement became cooperative. Instead of punitive, the neighborhood changed. The lights stayed up through the season. No longer symbols of stress, but reminders of what collective resistance could accomplish. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. A sense of shared ownership replaced quiet fear. The family never got an apology, but they got something more valuable. Validation, protection, change. What started as a $1,450 fine meant to silence, then became a catalyst that reshaped the entire community. It exposed how HOA power could be abused when left unchecked, and how quickly it could unravel when challenged with facts instead of fear. The decorations eventually came down, as all holiday decorations do, but the impact remained. The HOA still existed. Rules were still enforced. But the imbalance was gone. And every December after that, when the lights returned, they carried a different meaning. Not just celebration, not just tradition, but proof that even in the most controlled communities, authority still answers to accountability.